Picture this. A grand stone terrace carved into the Bavarian Alps, snow-capped peaks stretching to infinity, crystal clear mountain air, and inside, Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and a small circle of physicians gathered around polished oak tables signing documents that would authorize the systematic murder of hundreds of thousands. This wasn't a concentration camp. This wasn't a military headquarters. This was the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine retreat, the place where vacation photos were taken, where Eva Braun sunbathed, where diplomats sipped champagne. And in 1946, when American judges at the Nuremberg doctors' trial watched footage of this very location, it became the visual evidence that sealed the fate of 7 Nazi doctors. Because what the defense couldn't explain away was this: the orders came from the top, and the Berghof footage proved it. December 9th, 1946, Nuremberg, Germany, Palace of Justice, courtroom 600. 23 defendants sat in the dock. Not politicians, not generals, doctors. Men who had taken the Hippocratic Oath, men who wore white coats, not SS uniforms. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, clean-cut, articulate. He looked more like a university professor than a war criminal. Victor Brack, SS officer who oversaw the T4 euthanasia program, thin-framed glasses, bureaucratic precision. Joachim Prugowski, chief hygienist of the Waffen-SS, academic credentials from respected institutions, and 4 others who would eventually join them: Rudolf Brandt, Karl Gebhardt, Waldemar Hoven, Wolfram Sievers. 7 men, 7 death sentences. But here's what shocked the courtroom observers. The prosecution didn't just rely on documents. They didn't just parade survivor testimony, though there was plenty of that. They showed footage, propaganda films, newsreels, and yes, footage of the Berghof. Now you might be thinking, what does Hitler's mountain house have to do with medical experiments in concentration camps? Pause everything. Because the Burghoff wasn't just a retreat. It was where the machinery of the Holocaust was designed, where the T4 program, the so-called euthanasia initiative that murdered over 70 Eichauer disabled Germans, was born. Where Heinrich Himmler and Karl Brandt sat with Hitler and transformed medicine into murder. And when American prosecutor Telford Taylor stood before the judges and screened footage of that location, he wasn't just showing a building, he was showing the defendant's workplace. The projector clicks on, the courtroom darkens, black and white footage flickers across the screen. The Berghof in all its architectural grandeur. Designed by Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect. Massive windows overlooking the Obersalzberg Valley. A great hall with a retractable picture window that could be lowered into the floor, creating a seamless view of the mountains. Hitler, in civilian clothes, strolling the grounds, shaking hands with visitors. The image of a statesman, not a dictator. Eva Braun, laughing with her terriers on the stone terrace. And then, the interior shots, a long conference table, maps spread across polished wood, officers standing at attention. This is where strategy was made, where decisions about the fate of millions were signed into reality. The footage was propaganda, of course. Leni Riefenstahl and other Nazi filmmakers had shot thousands of hours documenting the regime. The Third Reich wanted the world to see Hitler as a cultured leader, surrounded by beauty and power. But in that Nuremberg courtroom, the footage had a different effect, because Telford Taylor narrated over the images. He pointed out the dates, the locations, the attendees. This is where Heinrich Himmler met with Hitler on August 18, 1939. Taylor's voice echoed in the courtroom. This is where the T4 program was discussed. This is where Karl Brandt received verbal authorization to begin mercy killings of the mentally ill. Pause. Think about what that means. The defendants had spent months claiming they were following orders from distant, unnamed superiors, that they were isolated, that they didn't know the full scope of the program, that they were just doctors trying to advance medical science under difficult wartime conditions. And then the judges saw footage of the exact location where their orders originated. Not some shadowy bunker, not a remote military installation, a luxury villa in the Alps, where Hitler entertained foreign dignitaries, where policy was made over afternoon tea. Let me show you why this mattered so much. The Berghof wasn't Hitler's occasional getaway. Between 1933 and 1945, he spent more time there than in Berlin. Think about that. The Führer of the Third Reich ran his empire from a mountain house. And this is where the T4 program was born. August 1939. Hitler summons Karl Brandt and Philipp Bauer, chief of the Führer's chancellery, to the Berghof. The conversation is brief, no stenographer present, no official minutes. Hitler gives verbal authorization. Certain doctors should be empowered to grant mercy death to patients deemed incurable after critical evaluation. The word used? Gnadentod, mercy death. Brandt later testified at Nuremberg that Hitler framed it as a humanitarian act, relieving suffering, freeing resources for the war effort. But here's the detail that destroyed Brandt's defense. The authorization was backdated to September 1st, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland, the day World War II began. Why backdate it? Because Hitler knew what he was authorizing was illegal, even under Nazi law, so he buried it in the chaos of war. And where was this decision made? The Berghof. Over the next 2 years, the T4 program expanded. Gas chambers were built at 6 psychiatric institutions across Germany. Carbon monoxide pumped into sealed rooms disguised as showers. Over 70 Azar people murdered. Disabled children, schizophrenic adults, elderly patients with dementia. And the doctors who ran the program, many of them visited the Berghof, received instructions, attended conferences in that great hall with the retractable window. Himmler was there too, constantly. He and Hitler discussed extending the T4 methodology to concentration camps. Why waste resources on prisoners who couldn't work? Why not apply medical selection to Jews, Poles, Soviet POWs? This is where the transition happened, from euthanasia program to extermination camps. And it all started at the Burghoff. Now comes the moment that changed everything at trial. The T4 program wasn't just theory, it became practice. And the doctors in the dock at Nuremberg weren't distant observers, they were architects. Karl Gebhardt, personal physician to Heinrich Himmler, conducted sulfanilamide experiments on prisoners at Ravensbrück concentration camp. He deliberately infected wounds with bacteria to test experimental drugs. Women screamed as gangrene set in. Limbs blackened. Many died in agony. Gebhardt's defense? He was testing treatments that could save German soldiers on the front lines, but the prosecution had documents, signed orders, and they traced back to meetings at the Berghof. Joachim Rogowski oversaw typhus experiments at Buchenwald. Prisoners were deliberately infected with the disease. Mortality rates exceeded 90% in some test groups. His defense? Military necessity. The Wehrmacht needed typhus vaccines. But here's what the judges saw in that footage. The Berghof wasn't a military installation. It was a policy center. And the policies included transforming human beings into laboratory animals. Waldemar Hoven, chief physician at Buchenwald, personally administered lethal injections to prisoners, sometimes for medical experiments, sometimes just to clear space in the infirmary. He claimed he was following orders from Berlin, but the paper trail led to the Berghof, to meetings between Himmler and Hitler, to authorizations signed by Karl Brandt, who had received his mandate directly from the Führer in that Alpine retreat. The prosecution built a timeline, every experiment, every authorization, every death. And at the center of that timeline was the Berghof, not as the physical location where experiments happened, but as the ideological birthplace, the place where medicine was redefined from healing to killing, where the Hippocratic Oath was replaced with racial ideology and military expediency. When Telford Taylor showed that footage to the judges, he was making a simple argument. These defendants weren't rogue actors. They were part of a system designed at the highest levels of the Nazi state, a system that turned the Berghof's conference rooms into the antechamber of Auschwitz. The defense attorneys scrambled. They objected. They claimed the footage was irrelevant. After all, none of the defendants were shown in the Berghof scenes, but the judges overruled the objections, because the footage established something crucial: proximity to power. These weren't isolated doctors making desperate choices in chaotic wartime conditions. These were physicians who attended conferences at Himmler's headquarters, who received funding from the Reich, who reported their findings to Karl Brandt, who shuttled between Berlin and the Berghof, carrying Hitler's verbal authorizations in his briefcase. The Berghof footage made it impossible to claim ignorance, impossible to claim distance from the regime's core. You could see it in the defendants' faces as the projector ran. Karl Brandt stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Victor Brack shifted in his seat. Gebhardt took notes, trying to maintain the appearance of academic detachment. But the damage was done, because the footage didn't just show a building. It showed the nerve center of the Reich, and these men had been connected to it, had drawn authority from it, had transformed its policies into practice. Survivor testimony hammered the point home. Jadwiga Zito, a Polish political prisoner, testified about the sulfanilamide experiments at Ravensbrück. She rolled up her sleeve to show the judges her scars. Deep tissue damage from deliberately infected wounds. She looked directly at Karl Gebhardt as she spoke. "He came to the camp personally," she said through a translator. "He selected us. He watched as they operated. He took notes while we screamed." Gebhardt's attorney tried to discredit her, claimed her memory was unreliable, that she couldn't definitively identify the doctor who had overseen her torture. But then the prosecution produced photographs. Gebhardt at Ravensbrück. Gebhardt in Himmler's office, Gebhardt at medical conferences where he presented findings from experiments on concentration camp prisoners, and the paper trail led back to authorizations that originated from discussions at the Berghof. Think about the psychology of this moment. The judges were American military officers. Brigadier General Telford Taylor led the prosecution. The bench included judges who had seen combat, who understood military necessity, who weren't naive about the brutal realities of war. They weren't predisposed to hand out death sentences to doctors, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the Berghof footage crystallized it, because it showed that this wasn't military medicine gone wrong under battlefield pressure. This was systematic, planned, authorized at the highest levels, in a villa where Hitler posed for propaganda photos with his dogs. The trial lasted from December 1946 to August 1947, 8 months of testimony. Over 400 documents entered into evidence. Dozens of survivors paraded their scars before the judges, and through it all, the Berghof footage remained a reference point. Prosecutors returned to it again and again. As you saw in the footage from the Obersalzberg, as documented in the films showing the Führer's headquarters, it became shorthand for the regime's centralized control, for the impossibility of the just following orders defense. Because if the orders came from the Berghof, from Hitler himself, then following them wasn't mitigation, it was collaboration. August 20th, 1947. The judges retired to deliberate. 23 defendants waited. The courtroom observers expected convictions. But death sentences? For doctors? That was unprecedented. Even at the main Nuremberg trials, where Göring and the top Nazi leadership were prosecuted, there had been acquittals. Life sentences, gradations of culpability. Surely some of these physicians would receive leniency. But on August 20th, 1947, the judges returned with their verdict. And here's what shocked everyone. 7 death sentences. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician. The man who had received the original T4 authorization at the Berghof. Guilty, death by hanging. Victor Brack, SS officer who administered the T4 program and later helped design gas chambers for extermination camps. Guilty, death by hanging. Rudolf Brandt, Himmler's personal administrative officer who coordinated medical experiments across the camp system. Guilty, death by hanging. Karl Gebhardt, the orthopedic surgeon who infected women at Ravensbrück and watched them die. Guilty, death by hanging. Waldemar Hoven, Buchenwald's physician who selected prisoners for execution and conducted phenol injection experiments. Guilty, death by hanging. Joachim Rogowski, chief hygienist who oversaw typhus experiments that killed hundreds. Guilty, death by hanging. Wolfram Sievers, director of the Ahnenerbe Institute who organized skeleton collection programs and high-altitude experiments. Guilty, death by hanging. 7 men, 7 death sentences. The courtroom erupted. Defense attorneys immediately filed appeals. Some defendants wept. Others sat in stunned silence. But the judge's written opinion made their reasoning clear. These weren't ordinary war crimes. This was the perversion of an entire profession. The transformation of healing into killing. And it had been systematic, planned, and authorized from the top. The Berghof footage had established the command structure. The documents had established the paper trail. The survivors had established the horror. Together, it was irrefutable. 5 other defendants received life sentences. 4 received prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. 7 were acquitted. But those 7 death sentences sent shockwaves through the medical community worldwide. Doctors, executed for following orders. The appeals process dragged on for months. Defense attorneys argued that the experiments, while regrettable, had been conducted under wartime conditions. That the Nuremberg Code, the ethical framework the judges had used to evaluate the crimes, was being applied retroactively. That medical ethics were culturally relative. The appeals were denied. June 1948, Landsberg Prison, Bavaria. The 7 condemned men were led to the gallows. Karl Brandt went first. He maintained his composure, made no final statement. The others followed in quick succession. By noon, all 7 were dead. Their bodies were cremated, ashes scattered in an undisclosed location to prevent any grave from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. But the trial's impact was just beginning. Because the judges hadn't just punished individual criminals, they had established a new framework for medical ethics, the Nuremberg Code. 10 principles governing human experimentation, informed consent, voluntary participation, the right to withdraw, minimization of harm, principles that seem obvious now. But in 1947, they were revolutionary. And they came directly from the doctor's trial, from the recognition that what had happened at Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, and Dachau couldn't be dismissed as wartime aberrations. They were the logical conclusion of medicine without ethics, science without humanity. And it had started at the Berghof, in those meetings between Hitler, Himmler, and Karl Brandt, where euthanasia became policy, where human beings became experimental subjects. The modern medical establishment owes its ethical foundation to 7 hangings in Bavaria, every informed consent form you sign before surgery, every ethics review board that evaluates research proposals, every protection afforded to human research subjects. They trace back to that courtroom in Nuremberg, to those judges watching footage of the Berghof, to the recognition that medicine could become murder if left unchecked. But here's the question that still haunts medical ethicists today. Could it happen again? The defendants at the doctor's trial weren't monsters. They were educated professionals, university-trained, published researchers. Some had international reputations before the war. Karl Brandt had been a promising young surgeon. Gebhardt was an orthopedic specialist who had treated Olympic athletes. Mrugowski held advanced degrees in bacteriology. These weren't sadists who sought out opportunities to torture. They were careerists who accepted the regime's framework, who convinced themselves that individual suffering could be justified by collective benefit. And that's what makes the Burghoff footage so damning, because it showed that the framework came from the top, that Hitler himself had redefined medicine's purpose, that the transformation from healing to killing wasn't accidental or localized. It was policy. When Karl Brandt stood before the judges and claimed he was trying to relieve suffering through the T4 euthanasia program, the prosecution pointed to the Berghof meetings. "You received authorization directly from Hitler," Telford Taylor said. "You understood that this authorization was illegal, which is why it was verbal rather than written. You knew that what you were doing violated medical ethics, which is why the program was conducted in secret." Brandt had no answer, because the Berghof footage had established that he wasn't a distant functionary. He was part of the inner circle. He had access to Hitler. He had authority. And he had used that authority to build the infrastructure of mass murder. The gas chambers tested in T4 facilities became the model for Auschwitz. The personnel trained in euthanasia centers were transferred to extermination camps. The bureaucratic procedures developed for killing disabled Germans were scaled up to kill millions of Jews, Poles, and Roma. It was a direct line. From the Berghof to the death camps, and the 7 men who hanged at Landsberg prison were nodes along that line. Now here's what most people don't know about the aftermath. The executions should have closed the chapter. Justice served. Lessons learned. But many of the defendants who received prison sentences were released early. By the mid-1950s, most were free. Some returned to medical practice. Not in Germany, where their names were notorious, but in other countries, under assumed names, with credentials that didn't mention Nuremberg. The Cold War complicated things. The Americans and Soviets were more interested in recruiting Nazi scientists and doctors than punishing them. Operation Paperclip brought hundreds of German researchers to the United States. Some had questionable wartime records. The prioritization shifted from accountability to utility. And this raises uncomfortable questions about the Nuremberg Code's real-world impact. Because while the principles were codified in 1947, they weren't immediately adopted. The U.S. didn't formally adopt them as federal policy until the 1970s, after scandals like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment forced a reckoning. The Tuskegee study ran from 1932 to 1972. African-American men with syphilis were observed without treatment, even after penicillin became available. They were never informed of their diagnosis, never given meaningful consent. Sound familiar? The parallels to Nazi medical experiments are obvious, not in scale or intent, but in the fundamental violation. Treating human beings as objects of study without consent or dignity. When the Tuskegee study was exposed in 1972, journalists and ethicists pointed directly to Nuremberg. "We condemned Nazi doctors for this," they said. "How can we tolerate it in our own country?" That's when the Nuremberg Code finally gained traction in American medical practice. It took 25 years, and a scandal. But the principles established in that courtroom, informed by that Berghof footage, finally became policy. Today, the Nuremberg Code is taught in every medical school. It's the foundation of the Declaration of Helsinki. It underpins federal regulations governing human subjects research. But the tension remains, because medical progress still requires experimentation. And experimentation requires subjects, and subjects, even with informed consent, bear risks. Where is the line between acceptable risk and exploitation? The Nazi doctors believed they were advancing science. They convinced themselves that the suffering of concentration camp prisoners could yield knowledge that would save German soldiers. The logic was utilitarian, the greatest good for the greatest number. But the Nuremberg judges rejected that logic entirely. They said that individual human dignity is inviolable, that no collective benefit justifies non-consensual experimentation, that medicine exists to serve patients, not states. And the Burghoff footage reinforced that point. Because what the judges saw wasn't battlefield medicine, it was policy made in luxury, decisions about who deserved to live and die, made over tea in an Alpine villa with a view of the mountains. The disconnect between the setting and the horror was unbearable. Hitler relaxing at the Berghof, signing authorizations for mass murder. Himmler discussing skeleton collection programs while admiring the architecture. Karl Brandt receiving orders to expand euthanasia while enjoying the hospitality of the Führer's retreat. It was banal, and that's what made it so terrifying. Hannah Arendt would later write about the banality of evil when covering the Adolf Eichmann trial. But she could have been describing the doctor's trial too. These weren't theatrical villains. They were bureaucrats, professionals, men who compartmentalized their work and their conscience. And the Berghof footage captured that compartmentalization perfectly. Here's the grand house where policy was made. Here's the beautiful setting. Here's the Führer in civilian clothes, playing with his dogs. And somewhere in those conference rooms, between the scenic views and the state dinners, decisions were made that would kill hundreds of thousands. That disconnect is what convinced the judges to impose death sentences, because they understood that the horror wasn't just in the camps, it was in the normalization, in the ability of educated men to attend meetings, discuss murder as policy, and then return to their families and their professional lives as if nothing had happened. The Burghoff represented that normalization. It wasn't a fortress, it wasn't a bunker. It was a home, a workplace, a place where evil was bureaucratized and scheduled between lunch and dinner. And when Telford Taylor showed that footage to the judges, he was showing them the machinery of the Holocaust at its source, not the gas chambers, not the crematoriums, but the place where those things were conceived and authorized. The 7 men who hanged at Landsberg prison were guilty of specific crimes, sulfanilamide experiments, typhus infections, lethal injections. But their larger guilt was participation in a system that had been designed at the Berghof, a system that transformed medicine from a healing profession into an instrument of genocide. That's why the death sentences were necessary, the judges argued, not just as punishment, but as a statement. Medicine has boundaries. States cannot redefine those boundaries for their own purposes. Doctors who violate those boundaries will be held individually accountable, regardless of orders from above. The Nuremberg Code codified that statement into 10 principles, and those principles remain relevant today. Consider contemporary debates about medical ethics, gain-of-function research that could create pandemic pathogens, gene editing of human embryos, artificial intelligence in diagnostic medicine. All of these raise questions that echo Nuremberg. Where's the line between scientific progress and unacceptable risk? Who gets to decide? What safeguards protect individuals from exploitation in the name of collective benefit? The Nuremberg Code doesn't answer all these questions. Medical ethics is more complex than 10 principles can capture, but it provides a foundation, a reminder that science without ethics is dangerous, that medicine without humanity is monstrous, and that reminder came from watching footage of the Berghof, from understanding that the Holocaust didn't emerge from chaos. It was planned, authorized, systematized, in a villa in the Alps where Hitler took his vacations. The legacy of the doctor's trial extends beyond medical ethics. It established the precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity. It rejected the superior orders defense. It held individuals accountable for participating in state-sponsored atrocities. These principles informed every subsequent war crimes tribunal, from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia to the International Criminal Court. The idea that I was following orders is not a complete defense, that individuals have a responsibility to refuse illegal or immoral commands, that professional obligations don't absolve criminal conduct. All of this traces back to Nuremberg, to those 7 death sentences, and to that footage of the Burghoff that made it impossible for the defendants to claim distance from the regime's crimes. June 2nd, 1948, the day of the executions. The families of the condemned men made final appeals to American authorities. Karl Brandt's wife pleaded for clemency. Gebhardt's attorney argued that medical experiments were standard practice in wartime. All appeals were denied. The hangings were carried out by Master Sergeant John C. Woods, the same executioner who had hanged the defendants from the main Nuremberg trials, including Joachim von Ribbentrop and Alfred Jodl. Woods was experienced, but not skilled. Several of the executions were botched. Some of the condemned men took minutes to die, struggling against the noose. It was neither quick nor painless. Some observers saw this as poetic justice. These men had inflicted prolonged suffering on their victims. Now they experienced a fraction of that suffering themselves. Others saw it as a failure of the very principles Nuremberg was supposed to establish. Even condemned war criminals deserved humane treatment. The debate continues. Do the architects of atrocity forfeit their claim to humane treatment? Or does maintaining ethical standards, even toward the guilty, distinguish justice from revenge? The Nuremberg judges believed the latter. That's why the trials were conducted with due process. Why the defendants had legal representation. Why evidence was meticulously documented and cross-examined. The point wasn't just to punish. It was to establish that justice could be systematic and fair even when prosecuting systematic and unfair crimes. The Berghof footage played a crucial role in that process. It was objective, undeniable. The defendants couldn't claim it was falsified or taken out of context. It showed what it showed, the headquarters of the regime, the place where decisions were made, the seat of power from which these doctors had drawn their authority. and that visual evidence, combined with documents and testimony, created an irrefutable case. The modern world still grapples with the questions raised at Nuremberg. What do we owe to research subjects? How do we balance individual rights against public health imperatives? What happens when doctors become agents of the state rather than advocates for patients? COVID-19 raised some of these questions in sharp relief. Mandatory vaccination policies, triage protocols for scarce resources, the speed of vaccine development, and the adequacy of testing. None of these are equivalent to Nazi medical experiments. The differences in intent, consent, and ethical oversight are vast, but the underlying tension is the same: individual autonomy versus collective benefit. The Nuremberg Code provides guidance, informed consent, voluntary participation, minimization of risk. But applying these principles in real-world crises is complicated, and that's why studying the doctor's trial remains essential, not just as history, but as a continuing ethical reference point. Because the capacity for medicine to be perverted still exists. The temptation to sacrifice individual dignity for utilitarian goals hasn't disappeared, and the warning from Nuremberg, reinforced by that Berghof footage, is clear. The slope is slippery and the descent is rapid once you start. 7 Nazi doctors hanged in 1948. Their names are largely forgotten outside of academic circles. Their crimes are overshadowed by the larger Holocaust narrative, but their trial established principles that shape medicine today. Every time a doctor obtains informed consent before a procedure, that's Nuremberg. Every time an ethics review board rejects a research proposal as too risky, that's Nuremberg. Every time medical students learn that their first obligation is to their patients, not to the state or to science, that's Nuremberg. The Berghof footage helped make that possible by showing the judges where the orders came from, by establishing that these weren't rogue actors but integral parts of a centralized system, by making it impossible to dismiss the crimes as wartime aberrations. The footage forced a reckoning with the fact that the Holocaust was planned, that it involved the collaboration of educated professionals, that medicine could become murder when ethics were abandoned, and that reckoning produced the Nuremberg Code. 77 years later, we're still living with its implications, still debating where to draw lines, still struggling to balance progress and protection, still trying to ensure that the horrors documented in that courtroom never happen again. The Burghoff still stands, partially. It was bombed by the Allies in the final days of the war. Much of it was demolished after German reunification to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site. But you can still visit the area. Still see the Eagle's Nest, the tea house built on the summit above the Berghof. Still walk the grounds where Hitler and Himmler and Karl Brandt made their plans. It's a tourist site now. Educational plaques explain the history, the crimes, the trials. And occasionally visitors watch the same footage that was shown at Nuremberg, the propaganda films showing the Berghof in its glory days. But now, the context is different. Now it's evidence of how a regime normalized evil, of how medicine was perverted, of how educated men convinced themselves that murder was policy, and of how a group of American judges, watching that footage in a courtroom in 1946, decided that 7 doctors would hang for their role in that perversion. Do you think the Berghof footage justified the death penalty for those 7 Nazi doctors? Or was execution too extreme? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal trials revealing, subscribe for more untold stories from the Nuremberg proceedings. There's so much more to uncover about how justice was pursued in the aftermath of the Holocaust. I'll see you in the next one.